In the shadow of the White Mountains, at the end of a long road through the forests of northern New Hampshire, there is a hotel that does not seem to belong to this world. Its white towers rise against the peaks like something conjured rather than constructed. Its red roof bleeds color into the gray mountain sky. Its verandas stretch wide and unhurried, as if time here moves differently than it does everywhere else. Slower, heavier, weighted with something that ordinary places are not asked to carry. Most people who find their way to the Omni Mount Washington Resort come for the scenery, for the skiing, the golf, the mountain air. They come to escape, and that is exactly what it was built for. In the summer of 1902, this palace opened its doors to the wealthiest people in America, the industrialists, the financiers, the old money dynasties who had built their fortunes in the smoke and noise of the Gilded Age and needed somewhere beautiful and remote to forget about it. The Mount Washington Hotel was their escape hatch, their refuge, a place deliberately designed to feel separate from the world and all its complications. But in July of 1944, the world followed them in. 730 delegates representing 44 nations climbed into these mountains for 3 weeks that would determine how money moved across the entire post-war world. Inside ballrooms built for dancing and dining rooms designed for leisure, they created the International Monetary Fund. They created the World Bank. They established the United States dollar as the backbone of global finance, a system that still shapes the economic reality of billions of people living right now today, whether they know it or not. They did all of it here, in this hotel, in these mountains. And then, almost completely, the world forgot. The delegates went home. The plaques went up on the bedroom doors, small brass, markers identifying which nation's representative slept in which room. The hotel went back to serving summer guests, and one of the most consequential gatherings in modern history quietly receded from public memory, leaving almost no trace in the cultural imagination of the country it transformed. How does a place this important disappear from the story it created? That is what this is about. Chapter 1. The Gilded Age and the Birth of the Grand Escape. To understand why a hotel like the Mount Washington was built at all, you have to understand the world that demanded it. The final decades of the 19th century produced a concentration of private wealth in America that had never existed before and has arguably never been matched since. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how things were made. It rewrote the rules of who could accumulate power and how fast they could accumulate it. Andrew Carnegie built a steel empire that fed a nation's appetite for railroads and skyscrapers. John D. Rockefeller turned oil into a monopoly so complete that the government would eventually have to dismantle it by law. Cornelius Vanderbilt and his heirs controlled the railroads that connected every corner of the continent. J.P. Morgan moved money with a confidence that made governments nervous. These men, and the dynasties that formed around them, weren't just wealthy by the standards of their time. They were wealthy in a way that had no real precedent in American life. And with that wealth came something new, the problem of what to do with it. The answer, for a significant portion of America's industrial aristocracy, was to leave. Not permanently, not in defeat, but seasonally, deliberately, and with considerable ceremony. Every summer, as the cities they had built became unbearable, choked with heat, crowded with the poor, thick with the smell of horses and industry and uncollected refuse, the wealthy packed their trunks and departed. They headed for the coast, for the mountains, for anywhere that offered clean air and the company of people who understood what it meant to have truly arrived. The White Mountains of New Hampshire became one of the most coveted destinations in this seasonal migration, and the reasons were not difficult to understand. The air was clean in a way that city air simply was not. The scenery was dramatic without being dangerous. Peaks and valleys and rushing rivers that provided the aesthetic thrill of wilderness while remaining comfortably accessible by the expanding railroad network. The social cachet was considerable. To summer in the White Mountains was to announce without saying a word that you belonged to a particular class of American life. You were not merely comfortable. You were the kind of person who could afford to disappear from the city for an entire season and not worry about what you were missing. The hotels that rose to serve this market were not hotels in any ordinary sense of the word. They were seasonal cities, self-contained worlds operating for 3 or 4 months a year, at a scale and ambition that would have seemed extraordinary even by the standards of the cities their guests had left behind. The profile house in Franconia Notch could accommodate hundreds of guests and offered its own orchestra, its own bowling alleys, its own carefully manicured grounds. The Crawford House sat at the entrance to Crawford Notch. Its wide porches filled every summer with the kind of people who expected and received the best of everything. The Mount Pleasant Hotel, sitting at the base of Mount Washington itself, drew guests who wanted the mountain's presence without the inconvenience of actually climbing it. These hotels competed ferociously for the same pool of wealthy guests, and the competition drove a constant escalation of luxury and spectacle. Every season brought new amenities, new entertainments, new reasons to choose one establishment over another. The men who owned and operated these resorts understood that they weren't simply selling beds and meals. They were selling a vision of life, a particular version of American success made visible and tangible and available for rent. And underlying all of it was a confidence that, from this distance in history, reads almost as delusion. The men who built these grand resorts in the 1880s and 1890s genuinely believed in the permanence of the world they were serving. The Gilded Age felt, from the inside, like an equilibrium rather than a peak. The wealth existed, the leisure class existed, the appetite for grand hotels in the mountains existed. Why would any of that change? By the late 1890s, that confidence was still intact, and the White Mountains, for all their grandeur, still lacked something. The existing hotels were impressive, but none of them was truly extraordinary. None of them made the kind of statement that the era seemed to be demanding. Someone would need to build the crown jewel. One man had both the resources and the restlessness to try. Chapter 2. Joseph Stickney, the man who built the dream. His name is not remembered the way Carnegie's is, or Vanderbilt's, or Rockefeller's. He left no foundation bearing his name, no university wing, no cultural institution that carries his legacy into the present. Joseph Stickney built one thing, one extraordinary, improbable, beautiful thing, and then he died before he could fully inhabit it. That, in its own quiet way, is one of the saddest stories the Gilded Age produced. Stickney was born in Concord, New Hampshire, which means that when he eventually turned his ambitions toward the White Mountains, it was not the detached calculation of an outside investor identifying a market opportunity. It was something more personal than that. The mountains were his. He had grown up in their shadow. He understood, in a way that no amount of money or research could manufacture, what they meant to the people who loved them, and what they could mean to the people who had never seen them. He left New Hampshire as a young man and went to Pennsylvania, where he made himself rich with a speed that was characteristic of the era. Coal brokerage was not a glamorous business. It was a business of supply chains and contracts and the unglamorous logistics of moving a resource that the industrial world could not function without. But Stickney had a gift for it. By the time he was 30 years old, he had accumulated the kind of fortune that most men spent entire lifetimes failing to reach. He had also developed the particular restlessness that tends to follow the achievement of a financial goal, the sense that the money was never really the point, that it was always just the means to something larger. The something larger, for Joseph Stickney, was the White Mountains. In 1881, he made his first move, together with his partner John N. Cunningham. He purchased the Mount Pleasant Hotel, the well-regarded resort sitting at the base of Mount Washington that had been drawing wealthy summer guests for years. It was a respectable property, a solid investment, and a first foothold in the world of White Mountain hospitality. For most men, it would have been enough. For Stickney, it was an education. Running the Mount Pleasant taught him the rhythms of the grand hotel business, the seasonal surge of arrivals, the elaborate machinery of staff and service, the particular psychology of guests who expected the best and had the means to go elsewhere if they didn't get it. It also taught him something more unsettling, that the existing hotels, for all their ambition, were not truly great. They were impressive, they were comfortable, but none of them was the kind of place that stopped people in their tracks. None of them made the statement that Stickney was beginning to believe the White Mountains deserved. He began to imagine something different, something that would not merely compete with the other grand hotels of the region, but would make them irrelevant by comparison. He hired Charles Allen Gifford to design it. Gifford was an architect of genuine accomplishment, whose portfolio included work associated with the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia, another playground of the American elite that understood exactly what its clientele wanted from a building. Stickney's instructions, in their essence, were straightforward. Build something that the wealthiest people in America will look at and feel they have arrived somewhere worthy of them. Gifford answered with Renaissance Revival architecture, a style that drew on the grandeur of Italian palace design, that spoke in the visual language of permanence and cultural authority. The choice was not accidental. In an era when American wealth was still measuring itself against European tradition, a hotel that looked like it belonged in Florence sent a very specific message. This is not a frontier country's idea of luxury. This is luxury by any standard the world has ever known. Construction began in 1900. What followed was a feat of organization and craftsmanship that remains remarkable even by modern standards. 250 Italian artisans were brought to the mountains of New Hampshire specifically to do the work that Gifford's design demanded. The exterior granite and stucco masonry, the ornate detailing, the Tiffany stained glass that would filter mountain light into colors that no ordinary window could produce. These were not general laborers. They were craftsmen, men whose skills had been developed over generations in a tradition that America's young industrial culture could not yet replicate domestically. The building they raised was staggering in its scale. The Y-shaped footprint spread across the mountain landscape with a confidence that suggested the hotel had always been there, and the mountains had simply grown up around it. Inside, the technical systems were as ambitious as the aesthetics. A steel frame superstructure gave the building a solidity that the wooden grand hotels of the era could not match. An electrical power plant generated the current that lit over 5,000 electric lights throughout the building. 11 miles of plumbing connected more than 2,000 doors and 12,000 windows into a single functioning organism. The numbers alone communicate something about the scale of what Stickney was attempting. The final cost was $1.7 million. In 1902, that sum could have built a small city. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary gamble, the kind of investment that only makes sense if you believe absolutely in what you are building and why. The hotel opened on July 28, 1902. The ceremony was attended by the kind of guests the building had been designed for. Wealthy, powerful, accustomed to the best the world offered. And Joseph Stickney, standing before them in the hotel that had consumed years of his life and a fortune most people could not comprehend, said something that has echoed down through the decades since. "Look at me, gentlemen," he told them, "for I am the poor fool who built all this." There is laughter in that line. There is the self-deprecating wit of a man who understood the absurdity of his own ambition. But there is something else in it too, something that only becomes audible in hindsight. A man who calls himself a fool at the moment of his greatest achievement is a man who understands, somewhere beneath the celebration, that the achievement has cost him something he cannot name, that the building is finished and the dream is real, and yet something about it feels not quite the way he had imagined. Within a year, Joseph Stickney was dead. A heart attack at the age of 64. He had spent decades building toward this moment and then barely lived to see it. He never experienced a full season as the owner of the completed hotel. He never saw the summer guests fill its rooms the way he had imagined. He never watched the trains unload at the station and felt the satisfaction of knowing that all those people had come, specifically because of what he had created. He built the dream and then left before the dream could give him anything back. Into the silence he left stepped his wife. Carolyn Stickney was, by the standards of her era, a woman in an impossible position. She had inherited not just a hotel, but a vision, her husband's vision. And the question of what to do with it was not straightforward. She could have sold. She could have stepped back and let managers run the operation, while she retreated into the comfortable widowhood that her considerable wealth made available. She did neither. Instead, she stayed. Summer after summer, she returned to the hotel and treated it not as an asset to be managed, but as a living expression of the man she had loved. She added to it. The sun dining room, the fourth floor between the towers, expansions that the original design had left room for. She commissioned a chapel on the grounds in his memory, a small and quietly beautiful building that said more about her grief and her devotion than any public statement could. The social world that surrounded her during these years was the world the hotel had been built for. Anne Carolyn inhabited it fully. She eventually remarried, moving in the elevated social circles that the hotel's reputation attracted, and that her own considerable wealth sustained. But, through all of it, the the remarriage, the social whirl, the decades of summers, she never stopped tending to what Joseph had built. She remained the hotel's most committed advocate, its most loyal guardian, the human thread connecting its present operation to the original dream that had brought it into existence. When Carolyn died in 1936, something that could not be replaced was lost. Not just a person, but a living link. The hotel would continue. It had already survived the first wave of Gilded Age decline, had adapted to Prohibition and the Depression's early years, had proven more resilient than many of its White Mountain competitors. But the person who had known Joseph Stickney, who had stood beside him at that opening ceremony, that person was gone. From 1936 onward, the Mount Washington Hotel would belong to the world in a different way. The people running it would know its history, but not its origin. They would understand its value, but not its meaning. And within 8 years, the world itself would come to claim it. Chapter 3. The Golden Age, a playground for the powerful. In the years before the First World War, before income tax and prohibition and the slow unwinding of the world Joseph Stickney had built for, the Mount Washington Hotel operated at a pitch of elegance that is genuinely difficult to imagine from this distance. Arrival was itself a performance. The trains came from Boston, from New York, from Philadelphia and Washington. Private cars attached to scheduled services, loaded with trunks that contained enough clothing for an entire season's worth of social obligations. Families didn't come to the Mount Washington for a weekend. They came for weeks, sometimes for the entirety of the summer, transplanting their domestic lives into the hotel's white walls and treating the mountains outside as an extension of their drawing rooms. The staff, hundreds of them, carefully trained and immaculately presented, materialized to receive luggage, escort guests to rooms, and begin the elaborate choreography of service that would continue uninterrupted until the season ended and the hotel closed its doors against the autumn cold. To walk through the entrance of the Mount Washington Hotel in those years was to enter a world that had been constructed with extraordinary care to feel inevitable. The Great Hall opened before arriving guests with the confidence of a space that had nothing to prove, its proportions generous, its details exact, the light falling through Tiffany-stained glass in colors that made the ordinary world outside seem impoverished by comparison. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead. Italian plasterwork traced patterns across the ceilings that the craftsmen who had built this place had brought with them from across the Atlantic. Every surface communicated the same message: you are somewhere that matters. The dining rooms continued the argument. Meals at the Mount Washington were not simply meals. They were social events, governed by a protocol as elaborate as anything that happened in the drawing rooms of Newport or the townhouses of Fifth Avenue. Guests dressed for dinner with a seriousness that acknowledged what dinner really was, the nightly theater of status and affiliation, in which the summer colony established and reinforced its social order. Who sat where, who spoke to whom, who was seen and how, and by which eyes that mattered. Outside, the verandas offered a different kind of performance space. The mountains were always present, framing every view, providing a backdrop of geological permanence against which the human dramas of the hotel played out. Guests gathered on the wide porches in the long summer evenings, the air cool and clean in a way that no city air could approximate, and talked about the things that people of their class talked about: business, politics, marriages, money, the endless social calculations that constituted the real work of their leisure. The golf course, designed by Donald Ross and open since 1915, added another dimension to the hotel's social ecosystem. Ross was the foremost golf course architect of the era, a Scotsman who had redesigned the American game's relationship with landscape, and his work at the Mount Washington gave the hotel's guests a course worthy of their expectations. Golf at this level was never purely athletic. It was a form of extended conversation, a setting in which relationships were built and business was conducted in the relaxed, unhurried atmosphere that only genuine leisure could provide. This was, in the end, what the Mount Washington Hotel was selling, and what its guests were buying. What they were buying was the experience of existing, for a season, in a world where everything had been arranged for their comfort, and nothing reminded them of the difficulties that wealth, at its scale, inevitably produced. The hotel was, in this sense, a machine for forgetting. A beautiful, meticulously maintained, extraordinarily expensive machine for forgetting. For a while, It worked perfectly. But America was changing in ways that the men who built Grand Mountain resorts had not anticipated and could not control. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1913, introduced federal income tax. It was not, in its early years, a devastating blow. The initial rates were modest, and the wealthy had accountants skilled enough to minimize the damage. But the direction was clear, and the direction mattered. The fortunes that had built the Gilded Age would not compound indefinitely. The state had established its claim on private wealth, and that claim would only grow over time. Prohibition arrived in 1920 and struck the grand hotel culture more directly than the income tax ever had. A resort that could not serve alcohol was a resort that had lost one of its primary social lubricants. The wines at dinner, the whiskey on the veranda, the champagne that marked arrivals and departures, and the 100 small celebrations that punctuated a season. Hotels adapted as best they could, but the adaptation was never quite complete. Something essential had been removed, and the guests felt its absence. Then, in October of 1929, the stock market collapsed. What followed was not simply an economic contraction. It was the destruction of the social world that had built and sustained every grand hotel in the White Mountains. The fortunes that had seemed permanent were revealed as fragile. Families that had summered in the mountains for generations found themselves unable to justify the expense. The trains that had arrived loaded with trunks and families, and the confident assumption of leisure, began arriving with fewer passengers and less luggage. Then they began arriving nearly empty. Across America, grand hotels that had seemed as permanent as the landscapes they occupied began to close. Some converted to other uses. Some simply stood empty, their elaborate interiors gathering dust, their staffs dismissed. The era that had produced them, the era that had demanded them, was ending with a swiftness that left almost no time to adjust. The Mount Washington was not immune. Carolyn Stickney was still alive, still present, still providing the continuity of personal connection that had kept the hotel anchored to its original vision. But even her devotion could not alter the mathematics of operating a building this size in an economy this broken. The gap between what the hotel cost to run and what it could earn in a shrunken market was widening with each passing season. The world the hotel had been built for was dissolving. The mountains remained, the white towers remained, the verandas and the great hall and the Tiffany glass remained, but the social order that had given all of those things their meaning, the unquestioned assumption that wealth was permanent and leisure was a right, and the Gilded Age was simply how America worked, that was gone, and no amount of grandeur could bring it back. Chapter 4: Decline, War, and the Edge of Oblivion. When Carolyn Stickney died in 1936, the Mount Washington Hotel lost something that no balance sheet could measure. For 30 years, she had been the constant, the human presence that connected the hotel's daily operation to the original dream that had brought it into existence. She had known Joseph. She had stood beside him at the opening ceremony. The hotel for Carolyn was never simply a property. It was a continuation of a person she had loved and lost too soon. And that quality of devotion, irrational, personal, resistant to the cold logic of profit and loss, had been the invisible force holding everything together through the Depression's worst years. Her nephew, Foster Reynolds, inherited both the hotel and the burden of that legacy. He was not an unserious man. He was capable enough to understand what he had been given and sober enough to understand the difficulty of his position. But he did not have Carolyn's emotional investment. He had not known Joseph Stickney. He had not watched the hotel rise from the mountain landscape and felt it as a personal achievement. For Reynolds, the Mount Washington was an inheritance, magnificent, complicated, and increasingly difficult to justify keeping open. The Depression had thinned the hotel's clientele to a fraction of its golden age numbers. The guests who had once arrived by the trainload, settling in for entire summers with trunks full of evening wear, had been replaced by a smaller, more cautious crowd. People who could still afford the trip, but came for shorter stays, spent less freely, and carried with them the particular anxiety of wealth that had survived hard times, but could not quite forget how close the edge had been. Reynolds managed. He kept the hotel operating through the late 1930s, navigating the gap between costs and revenue with the pragmatism of a man who understood that survival in those years was itself a form of success. But the trajectory was not encouraging. Each season was harder than the last. Each year the mathematics grew more difficult. And then the war came, and the mathematics became impossible. The United States entered World War II in December of 1941, and within months the calculus of running a luxury mountain resort had been transformed entirely. Fuel was rationed, labor was scarce, as the young men who had staffed the grand hotels went instead to staff the military. Travel itself became complicated. The trains that had once delivered wealthy families to the mountains were now moving soldiers and materiel. The idea of a prolonged summer holiday at a grand resort felt, in the atmosphere of wartime sacrifice and national urgency, not merely impractical, but faintly indecent. In 1942, the Mount Washington Hotel closed. It is tempting to describe this as a wartime inconvenience, a temporary pause that the hotel would weather and recover from, the way a business might close for renovations and reopen renewed. But that framing misses what the closure actually represented. The world that had built the Mount Washington Hotel, the world of Gilded Age fortunes and grand seasonal migrations and summers-long retreats into mountain elegance, that world was not paused in 1942. It was finished. The war was not interrupting the Golden Age. It was burying it. The hotel sat empty in its mountain valley. The great rooms fell silent. The verandas, which had held so many thousands of people across so many seasons, stood vacant against the mountain air. The golf course grew untended. The Tiffany glass filtered light into rooms that no one occupied. And then, in 1944, it was sold. A Boston syndicate purchased the Mount Washington Hotel and its surrounding property for approximately $450,000. Sit with that number for a moment. Joseph Stickney had spent $1.7 million building this hotel in 1902. He had brought 250 Italian craftsmen across the Atlantic. He had installed 11 miles of plumbing and wired the building for thousands of electric lights and raised a structure so ambitious that it still dominates its landscape more than a century later. $1.7 million at a time when that sum represented a staggering concentration of private capital. 42 years later, the same building sold for $450,000. The arithmetic tells the story more efficiently than any description of Depression-era decline or wartime sacrifice could manage. The gap between those two numbers, between what it cost to build and what it sold for, is a precise measurement of what had happened to the world the hotel was built for. The Gilded Age confidence that had made the Mount Washington possible, the assumption that grand things built for wealthy people would always find wealthy people willing to pay for them, had been worth, in the end, approximately $1.25 million. That was the price of the dream. That was what it cost, in the final accounting, to believe that the world would always be the way it was. The hotel sat in the possession of its new owners, empty and undervalued, somewhere between its glorious past and an uncertain future. What happened next, no one could have predicted. The United States government, in the spring of 1944, was wrestling with a problem that no government had ever faced in quite the same form. The war was going to end. Everyone with access to accurate information understood by 1944 that Germany and Japan would eventually be defeated. The question consuming the minds of the most sophisticated economic thinkers in the Roosevelt administration was not whether the Allies would win. It was what winning would actually mean for a world whose financial architecture had been shattered as completely as its physical one. They needed to design something new. They needed to bring together the economic representatives of 44 nations and forge, from argument and compromise and the particular pressure that only genuine crisis can generate, a global financial system that could hold the post-war world together. They needed a place to do it, a place large enough to house 730 delegates, remote enough to provide security and focus, isolated enough to keep the negotiations insulated from the political pressures of Washington and the financial pressures of Wall Street. They needed, in other words, a very large hotel in a very quiet place. The most powerful government on earth looked at its options and chose an empty palace in the mountains of New Hampshire that had just sold for less than a third of what it had. Cost to build. The Poor Fool's Hotel was about to become the most important room in the world. Chapter 5. July 1944. The 3 weeks that shaped the world. By the summer of 1944, the world had been burning for 5 years. Europe was a continent of ruins. Cities that had stood for centuries had been reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns of a scale and ferocity that previous generations could not have imagined. Tens of millions of people were dead. The physical infrastructure of an entire civilization, its roads, its bridges, its factories, its ports, had been systematically destroyed by the most industrialized war in human history. And the end, while now visible on the horizon, had not yet arrived. The beaches of Normandy had been taken just weeks before. The Pacific War ground on with no clear conclusion in sight. But in the offices of the Roosevelt administration, and in the equivalent offices of the Allied governments in London and beyond, certain minds were already looking past the war to the problem that would follow it. Because the problem that would follow it was enormous, and it was not the kind of problem that solved itself. The world needed a new financial order. To understand why, you have to understand what the old one had cost. The years between the First and Second World Wars had been, in economic terms, a catastrophe of coordination failure. Nations had responded to the pressures of the Great Depression by turning inward, raising trade barriers, abandoning the gold standard at different times and in different ways, devaluing their currencies in competitive spirals that benefited no one and destabilized everyone. International trade collapsed. Capital flows froze. Countries that might have pulled each other toward recovery instead pulled each other deeper into crisis. The economic chaos of the 1930s did not cause the Second World War by itself, but it created the conditions, the desperation, the nationalism, the collapse of international trust, in which the war became possible. The men who had watched this happen, who had studied it and lived through it, and in some cases tried and failed to prevent it, were determined that it would not happen again. What they needed was an architecture, a set of rules and institutions and agreements that would govern how national economies related to each other, that would prevent the competitive devaluations and trade wars and financial panics that had turned a stock market crash into a global catastrophe. They needed to build this architecture before the war ended, because once the war ended, the political will to cooperate would begin to dissolve. Crisis created the conditions for agreement. Peace would create the conditions for disagreement. The window was narrow, and everyone in a position to understand it knew it. The question of where to hold the negotiations was more consequential than it might appear. Washington was impossible, too political, too subject to the lobbying pressures of Wall Street and the congressional maneuvering that would inevitably complicate any agreement. It reached in the capital's shadow. New York was worse. London carried its own complications, not least the fact that Britain's diminished post-war position was itself one of the central tensions the conference would need to navigate. What the negotiations required was neutral ground, somewhere removed from the centers of financial and political power, somewhere that could provide the focus and the isolation that an agreement of this magnitude demanded. Someone in the Roosevelt administration looked at a map and found a recently purchased hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. The Mount Washington Hotel was large enough. Its hundreds of rooms could accommodate the delegations. It was remote enough. The mountains provided a natural barrier against the noise and pressure of the outside world. It was, crucially, available. The new owners had acquired it cheaply and would welcome the income. And it possessed something harder to quantify, but genuinely important. A grandeur, a seriousness of physical presence that matched the weight of what was being attempted inside it. 150 federal workers were dispatched to the hotel in advance of the conference. They renovated, prepared, and transformed the building that had been standing largely dormant. The government paid the owners $300,000 for the disruption to their business. History, in a transaction that still carries a certain absurdity, literally renting a pleasure palace built for the idle rich in order to redesign the global financial system. In July of 1944, they began to arrive. 730 delegates representing 44 nations made their way to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They came from governments that were still at war, from economies that had been shattered, from countries whose futures were entirely unresolved. They carried with them the weight of their nation's interests and the knowledge that what was decided in these mountains would shape the world their children would inhabit. The atmosphere, by all accounts, was extraordinary, tense and purposeful, and strange in a way that the mountain setting only intensified. These were not men accustomed to grand resort hotels. Many of the delegations came from countries where the concept of a luxury mountain retreat was almost incomprehensibly foreign. And yet here they were, walking the same verandas where Gilded Age industrialists had once gathered in the long summer evenings, sleeping in the same rooms where wealthy families had once spent entire summers, conducting the most consequential financial negotiations of the century in spaces designed for the express purpose of forgetting that the outside world existed. Two figures dominated the proceedings, and their conflict illuminated everything that was at stake. Harry Dexter White was the American chief negotiator, a Treasury Department economist of formidable intelligence and harder ambition. White understood, with a clarity that left little room for sentiment, that America's position at the end of the war would be unlike anything the world had seen. The United States had emerged from the Depression and the war as the dominant economic power on the planet. Its industrial capacity was intact, its gold reserves were enormous, its currency was strong. White intended to build the post-war financial order on American terms, and he arrived in New Hampshire prepared to use every tool of negotiation available to ensure that outcome. Across the table from him, in the most literal sense, sat John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was, by 1944, the most influential economist alive, a man whose ideas about government spending and economic management had already begun reshaping how the world thought about money and crisis. He was also, by 1944, a man in failing health, his heart weakened by years of overwork and stress, his physical energy rationed carefully across the long days of negotiation. But his mind remained what it had always been, the sharpest instrument in any room he entered. Keynes came to Bretton Woods representing Britain, which meant he came representing a country whose global power had been mortally diminished by 2 world wars and whose economic future depended heavily on the generosity or self-interest of the Americans sitting across the table. He had his own vision for the post-war financial system, more internationally balanced than White's, less tilted toward American dominance, more protective of smaller economies trying to manage their own recovery. He argued for it with the full force of his intellectual reputation. What happened in the rooms and hallways and meeting spaces of the Mount Washington Hotel over those 3 weeks was the collision and eventual compromise of these two visions. The arguments were real, and the stakes were genuine, and the pressure was unlike anything that the building's original guests could have imagined when they sat on those same verandas discussing the summer's social calendar. In ballrooms built for dancing, economic frameworks were debated. In dining rooms designed for the performance of leisure, the structure of global trade was negotiated line by line. In a building whose entire purpose had been to help the wealthy forget about the world, the shape of the post-war world was being decided by men who could think of nothing else. And in one specific room, the Gold Room, its name carrying an irony that no one could have planned, the formal agreements were reached. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank was established in that room, and the agreement that would govern global currency for the next 3 decades was reached in that room. The United States dollar would become the world's reserve currency, fixed to gold at $35 per ounce, with all other participating currencies fixed to the dollar in a system of stable exchange rates designed to prevent the competitive devaluations that had helped destroy the interwar economy. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential financial agreements in modern history. The system it created would underpin the post-war economic boom, the extraordinary growth of the 1950s and 1960s that lifted living standards across the developed world and provided the stable financial environment in which international trade could flourish. The institutions it founded still exist, still operate, still shape the economic lives of billions of people in ways that most of those people never think about. All of it decided in a mountain hotel in New Hampshire. When the conference ended, the delegates left. The government workers packed up their materials. The mountain roads that had carried 730 people from across the world emptied back into their ordinary quietness. The hotel, which had briefly been the most important room on the planet, began its return to silence. Before they departed, someone arranged for small plaques to be placed outside each bedroom door, markers identifying which nation's delegation had occupied which room during the conference. The gesture was modest and practical, a record of who had slept where during 3 weeks that mattered. The plaques are still there. In 3 weeks, the Mount Washington Hotel had done more to shape the trajectory of the modern world than most of the world's great capitals had managed in decades. the IMF and the World Bank, and the dollar's dominance and the financial architecture of the post-war order. All of it born in a building that Joseph Stickney had raised so that wealthy Americans could escape the complications of the world. And then the summer guests came back. And the world, with the particular ingratitude that history reserves for its most inconvenient debts, began to forget. Chapter 6, After Bretton Woods. The delegates left in late July of 1944, and the Mount Washington Hotel settled back into its mountain quiet. The plaques went up on the bedroom doors. The staff returned to the routines of ordinary hospitality. Summer guests arrived, as they had always arrived, drawn by the mountains and the air, and the particular atmosphere of a grand resort that had somehow survived the Depression and the war, and the long unraveling of the world that had built it. Life at the hotel resumed its familiar rhythms, and the 3 weeks that had just passed, the 730 delegates, the 44 nations, the agreements that would govern the movement of money across the entire post-war world, receded into the background the way that extraordinary events sometimes do when ordinary life reasserts itself around them. The Bretton Woods system, meanwhile, went to work. What had been agreed in those White Mountain rooms in July of 1944 became, in the years that followed, the invisible architecture of the post-war economic order. The dollar's centrality gave international trade a stable foundation. The fixed exchange rates prevented the competitive currency devaluations that had helped spiral the 1930s into catastrophe. The IMF provided a mechanism for countries facing balance of payments crises to access emergency support, without having to collapse their economies in the process. The World Bank began channeling capital toward reconstruction and development in a world that desperately needed both. The results were, by historical standards, remarkable. The 1950s and 1960s produced an economic expansion across the developed world that has few precedents in the modern era. Living standards rose, international trade flourished, the industrial economies of Western Europe rebuilt themselves with a speed that astonished the economists who had designed the system meant to support them. Japan emerged from defeat and occupation to become one of the world's leading economies within a generation. The post-war boom was not caused solely by Bretton Woods. Reconstruction aid, technological innovation, pent-up consumer demand, and 100 other factors all played their roles. But the stable financial architecture agreed upon in the Gold Room of the Mount Washington Hotel provided the foundation on which all of it was built. None of this made its way back to the hotel in any meaningful sense. There were no ceremonies, no commemorations, no annual gatherings of finance ministers returning to the mountain valley where their predecessors had changed the world. The plaques stayed on the doors. The Gold Room hosted dinners and receptions, and the hotel focused, as it had always focused, on the practical business of filling its rooms and serving its guests. Because the world was changing in ways that were not kind to Grand Mountain resorts, the same post-war prosperity that Bretton Woods had helped create was reshaping American life in ways that threatened the hotel's survival. The interstate highway system began spreading across the country through the 1950s, fundamentally altering how Americans traveled. Where a journey to the White Mountains had once required a multi-day train trip that made a long stay at a grand resort the only practical option, it could now be accomplished by car in a single day. The economics of the week-long or month-long stay, the economics that had built the Mount Washington's Golden Age, no longer applied. Guests could drive up for a few days and drive home. The seasonal migration that had sustained the grand hotel culture was becoming a weekend trip. Air travel accelerated the disruption. As commercial aviation became accessible to the middle class through the late 1950s and 1960s, the geography of American leisure expanded dramatically. Why spend a week in New Hampshire when you could fly to Florida or California or Europe in the time it would have taken to drive to the mountains? The White Mountains remained beautiful, but beauty was no longer a scarce enough commodity to guarantee guests. The hotel passed through a succession of ownership changes across the post-war decades, each transition carrying its own mixture of hope and difficulty. New owners arrived with plans for renovation and revitalization, invested in improvements, adjusted the marketing, and tried to find a way to make the hotel's history and physical grandeur relevant to a leisure market evolving faster than any single institution could easily follow. The effort was genuine, and the results were mixed. The hotel survived where so many of its White Mountain contemporaries did not, but surviving and thriving were not the same thing. In 1991, the property sold to MWH Preservation Limited Partnership for $3.1 million, a figure modest for a property of this scale, but representing at least some recovery from the $450,000 nadir of 1944. The renovations that followed stabilized the building and prepared it for a significant symbolic step. In 1999, for the first time in its nearly century-long history, the Mount Washington Hotel opened for winter season. It was a milestone that revealed everything about the hotel's changed circumstances. Joseph Stickney had built a summer palace, a place defined by the specific pleasures and social rituals of the warm months, a destination that closed its doors against the winter and waited for the season to return. Opening year-round was an adaptation born of economic necessity, a recognition that seasonal operation could no longer sustain a building of this scale. The guests who now filled its rooms in February came for the skiing. The months-long summer social season that had defined the Golden Age was a memory. Omni Hotels and Resorts assumed management in 2009 and brought the resources of a major hospitality corporation to bear on decades of accumulated need. The renovations that followed modernized the hotel's facilities while preserving the architectural character that made it worth preserving. The spa expanded, the restaurants were reimagined, the conference facilities were upgraded to attract the corporate retreats and meetings that now represented a crucial segment of the hotel's business. In 2015, Omni purchased the property outright, completing a transition from management contract to full ownership. The hotel survived. That fact deserves acknowledgement. Across the White Mountains, the landscape is marked by the absence of grand hotels that did not survive, properties that closed, burned, were demolished, or simply decayed into memory. The Profile House is gone. The Crawford House is gone. The Mount Pleasant Hotel that Joseph Stickney purchased in 1881 was demolished in 1939. The Mount Washington stands where they do not, its white towers still rising against the same peaks, its red roof still visible from the roads below. But the Gold Room, the specific room where the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were formally established, now hosts weddings, corporate dinners, holiday parties. The room where Keynes and White and the representatives of 44 nations concluded one of the most consequential negotiations of the 20th century is available for rental. The plaques remain on the bedroom doors. They have always remained. But the guests who sleep behind those doors are there for the mountains, for the skiing, for the spa, for the experience of staying somewhere grand and historic. They pass the plaques in the hallway, and some of them pause to read, and most of them move on. And the weight of what those small brass markers represent goes largely unacknowledged. The system created at Bretton Woods lasted 27 years. In August of 1971, President Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility in a single televised address. The announcement that came without warning, that undid in minutes what 730 delegates had spent 3 weeks constructing. The financial architecture designed in that mountain hotel was dismantled by a president who had not been in the room when it was built. The hotel has now stood for more than 120 years. It outlasted by decades the agreement it hosted. The hotel that helped design the post-war leisure economy has been absorbed into that economy so completely that almost no one notices the irony. Joseph Stickney built it to help people forget the world, and the world in the end returned the favor. Chapter 7. The Tragedy of Consequence Without Memory. There is a particular kind of tragedy that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ruins or graves or the visible wreckage that history usually leaves behind to mark its most significant passages. It arrives quietly, incrementally, through the accumulation of small forgettings, a moment of supreme consequence gradually filed away in the specialized literature where only economists and historians think to look for it. The Mount Washington survived. Its towers still stand, its rooms still fill. By the conventional measures of institutional success, it endured where so many of its contemporaries did not. The Mount Washington's greatest chapter has been quietly, almost completely erased from the popular imagination of the country it helped shape. Consider what happened in the summer of 1944 against the backdrop of other gatherings that history has chosen to remember. Bretton Woods shaped something equally consequential. The decisions made in that mountain hotel governed the movement of money across the entire global economy for nearly 3 decades and established institutions that still operate today, still make decisions that affect the economic lives of billions of people, still carry the foundational assumptions that were hammered out in the gold room of the Mount Washington Hotel in July of 1944. And yet, Bretton Woods occupies almost no space in the cultural memory of the country that hosted it and benefited most from it. The reason, when you look for it, is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Financial systems are invisible, wars leave ruins. The physical evidence of conflict, the bombed cities, the military cemeteries, the monuments and memorials, keeps the memory alive by making it visible. You can stand in Normandy and understand viscerally what happened there. You can walk through the remnants of Warsaw and feel the weight of what was destroyed. The evidence is present in the landscape, demanding acknowledgement. Borders drawn at Versailles or Yalta can be traced on maps. The Cold War division of Europe was a physical reality. Walls, checkpoints, the literal partition of cities, that no one living near it could ignore or forget. But what does a currency agreement look like? What photograph captures the moment the dollar became the world's reserve currency? What monument marks the place where the IMF was established? The agreements reached at Bretton Woods left no ruins, no borders, no physical evidence of their existence beyond a set of institutional offices in Washington and the small brass plaques on the bedroom doors of a New Hampshire hotel. The consequences of those agreements are everywhere. In the structure of international trade, the existence of the IMF and World Bank, and the dollar's continued dominance in global finance decades after the specific system agreed upon in 1944 was dismantled. But consequences, when they are economic rather than military, when they manifest as stability rather than drama, when they operate through institutions rather than armies, have a way of disappearing into the background of ordinary life. The hotel has tried in its way to hold on to the history. The marketing materials mention Bretton Woods, gesture toward the conference. Note that something significant happened here. There are tours, references, the careful preservation of historical detail by people who understand what the building witnessed. But there is an inherent tension in trying to sell the weight of Bretton Woods, alongside destination weddings and ski weekends and corporate retreats. History of this magnitude is not easily packaged as an amenity. The conference that established the IMF and World Bank is not, in the end, what most guests are thinking about when they book a room at the Omni Mount Washington Resort. The question this raises is one that buildings cannot answer for themselves. Does a place carry the weight of what happened inside it, or does history only exist in the people who choose to carry it? The honest answer is that history lives in neither places nor people with any reliability. It lives in attention, in the sustained, deliberate act of choosing to remember, to teach, to return to a moment and insist on its significance. And that attention for Bretton Woods has largely not been paid. The Mount Washington Hotel shaped the financial world that billions of people inhabit today. It stands as one of the most consequential buildings of the 20th century by any reasonable measure of consequence. It is remembered in the main as a lovely place to ski. That is the tragedy, quiet, invisible, and almost total. Chapter 8. The Palace That Held the World. Joseph Stickney built this hotel so that powerful people could forget about the world. That is not a cynical reading of his intentions. It is simply what the Mount Washington Hotel was designed to do, to provide, for the wealthy and the influential, a space of sufficient beauty and remoteness that the pressures of the world they had built could not follow them in. A palace of deliberate forgetting, raised at extraordinary cost in the mountains of New Hampshire, by a man who understood what the American elite needed and had the resources and the restlessness to give it to them. He could not have imagined what he was actually building, not just a hotel, not just a monument to Gilded Age confidence and the ambitions of a self-made coal baron from Concord. He was building, without any awareness of it, the room where the world would one day be remade. The specific physical space, those ballrooms, that gold room, those hallways and verandas and mountain views, would become, 42 years after his death, the most consequential meeting place of the 20th century's middle decades. The palace built for escape would become the palace where escape was no longer possible, where the weight of the entire post-war world pressed down on 730 delegates and demanded that they find answers. The ironies of this story accumulate until they become something heavier than irony, something closer to the way history actually works, indifferent to intention, careless of design, using what is available rather than what was prepared, built for escape, used for consequence, designed for permanence, nearly sold for nothing. The system it hosted lasted 27 years before a single presidential announcement dissolved it. The hotel has lasted more than 120. The most important thing that ever happened within its walls had nothing whatsoever to do with why those walls were built. And the quiet tragedy at the heart of all of it is not decay. It is not abandonment or collapse or the visible ruin that marks the endings of other grand buildings from other grand eras. The Mount Washington Hotel stands. Its towers are intact. Its rooms are occupied. By the measures that buildings are usually judged by, it endured. The tragedy is indifference. The slow, almost total cultural forgetting of a moment that still shapes the world. Every currency exchange happening right now, every IMF intervention in a struggling economy, every World Bank development loan extended to a country trying to build its future. All of it carrying, buried somewhere in its institutional DNA, the agreements reached in a mountain hotel in New Hampshire in 3 weeks of July 1944, present in consequence, absent from memory. The verandas still face the peaks that Joseph Stickney looked at as a boy growing up in New Hampshire, the same peaks that framed every season of the hotel's long and complicated life. And somewhere in that building, in the silence between wedding receptions and ski weekends, in the gold room after the last guests have gone, and the chairs have been stacked and the lights turned low, the weight of 3 weeks in July 1944 still sits, largely unacknowledged, patiently waiting, for someone to walk past that brass plaque on the bedroom door and stop, and read it, and understand for just a moment what this place actually was.